seems to me that the purpose of life is to find a mode of being that is so meaningful that the fact that life is suffering is no longer relevant. Now, I have a follow-up, just a segue from that, but is that an accurate quote?
Well, I don't know if it's an accurate quote, but it sounds like something I probably said.
Accurate sentiment,
it's
more
accurately attributed.
Accurately attributed, all right.
It seems to me that it's true. I mean, it isn't necessarily the case that you can do it.
All right. Yeah. So
it's hard to do. I mean, and that, of course, it's hard, I suppose, in proportion to the suffering that you're undergoing. And it isn't necessarily the case that you can always manage it, but sometimes you can manage it, and it's good if you can. See, people need to search for meaning because they get corrupted by suffering if their life isn't meaningful. That's how it looks to me. Because you can't torture an animal forever without it lashing out. And so if your life is nothing, if there's nothing in it that speaks to you, there's still going to be suffering. You can't talk yourself out of that. And so then I see people tearing down traditional structures, let's say, or they're casual about them. Another rule in this new book is do not casually denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. Well, why social institutions? Well, I've counseled lots of people who were lost. And so if you came to see me and I was your therapist, I'm very practical. I'd say to you, okay, well, let's look at your life for a minute. Do you have an intimate relationship? What about your family? And that could be, married with kids, or it could be the family of your birth, your siblings and your parents and so on. How's that functioning? Do you have anyone there? Do you have a job, or maybe a career even if you're fortunate, but at least a job that keeps body and soul together and maybe where there's some chance of advancement and hope? Do you know how to use your time outside of work productively? Do you take care of your mental and physical health? Do you manage the temptations, drug and alcohol use and that sort of thing? Do you manage those temptations effectively? Are you educated? Are you as educated as you are intelligent? Have you? And those are standard patterns of activity in the world. Do you have kids? Do you have a wife? Or a husband? Do you have a job? I mean, it's mundane in some sense, and you can look beyond all those standard answers for meaning. But if you're overwhelmed by life, anxious and suffering, that's a good place to start. Put that together. Why? Well, the answer to that is because that's what people do. That's what people do. That's the best we've been able to manage. And if you don't have that, because you're a human being like other human beings, you're going to suffer for it. And so attacks on that, assaults on that aren't that helpful. Like I have this friend, he's an atheist, and he's wavering about this. He was born a communist. He was raised in Poland. And he had objected at one point to the Christmas traditions of his family, who were also atheistic. And, he objected on the grounds of logical coherence. Why are we doing this? Well, don't do it. Well, then what happens? Well, then you have another weekday. You lose Christmas. Well, great. It's like now you're logically coherent. Wonderful. But you've lost Christmas. You don't want to throw these things away. When I see this sometimes with young people when they're talking about getting married. We don't need to get married. We don't need a piece of paper. It's like, really? That's the depth of thought you've put into this? It's like you're not going to mark this permanence with conscious awareness and social celebration and the sanction of your community and a beautiful ceremony? That's just nothing? You're going to let that go? Well, what are you going to replace it with? Nothing.
What would be a successful effect for this book? looking back 12 months from now, 24 months from now?
Well, it would be lovely if it had the same effect on people as the last book appeared to have. I mean, it's comforting to me to read through my YouTube comments. Oddly enough, because that isn't generally a place people would go for comfort. Untold numbers of people have said to me in person, but publicly in that way, that they've put their lives together, at least in some ways. And you talked about Viktor Frankl. When I wrote Maps of Meaning, I said, well, I was interested in malevolence. I was deeply affected by the accounts I'd read of what happened in the Second World War and in Germany, and what happened in the Soviet Union and in China. These horror shows that characterized the 20th century. Constrained malevolence. And so if you study malevolence, you start to understand what the opposite of that is. The opposite of malevolence is something like the hero's journey. And it's easy to be cynical about that, but, well, it's not that easy, because if you're cynical about that, then you undermine your own life. And everyone knows this. This is the other thing that's so interesting. Everyone knows this. You never teach someone you love to lie. You're always appalled if you have a son or daughter. You're always appalled if they don't tell the truth. You know in the deepest part of your heart that if you don't tell the truth, the world falls apart. And that's actually true. I talked about unearned wisdom. It's no trivial matter to understand that. Dostoevsky said everyone is responsible for everything that happens to them and everything that happens to everyone else as well. And, that's an insane statement, and he was a very extreme person, but it's also true. And I think that's part of what people get a glimpse of when they have a hallucinogenic induced religious experience. It's like there's a lot more resting on you than you think. And you know that. You don't wake up in the morning berating yourself for telling the truth. You wake up at 4 a.m. berating yourself for violating your conscience. I'm aware of all the criticisms of ideas like that, but it's really something that you can't control your conscience. So what is it exactly? It's not you. You're responsible to it. It holds you accountable. It transcends you. So what is it? Well, if you think it's nothing, well, violate it for a while and see what happens. So, I hope what I wrote in Beyond Order is true. And if it's true, it should do some good. Because what's true does good. At least that's the hope.
I'm doing one thing really stupidly that I should stop doing. It's like, how long is it going to take you to figure out what that is? It's about 2 seconds, right? You've known it forever. And you could even make it less demanding. You could say, there are some stupid things that I'm doing that I know are stupid and wrong, that I could stop doing, that I would stop doing. And then you can just start with that. And you can just do that. And maybe it's just a little thing, although it's not, because it's a step forward on the proper voyage. It's not a small thing. And you think, well, what would happen? You could say, let's do this for a year or even a month. Just try not to do things you know to be stupid and wrong for a month. And that means not to say things you know to be stupid and wrong as well. Maybe that's the most important thing. Just do it as an experiment. see what happens. And it's so fun because I have people writing to me from all over the world who are saying they're doing that. They're saying, well, you know, I cleaned up my room and then I stopped saying stupid things, and my God, it's like things are way better. It's like, who would have guessed it? You know? And so it's low-hanging fruit, man. Because that's the other thing. If there's a lot of things wrong with you, then it's really easy to start fixing it, you know? You got there's so much territory that you can inhabit. I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee. That's good. I mean, the whole nation thing, that's positive, but to have God on your side, that's, you know, you might want that when things get rough. That would be good. And make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Wonderful. That's a good deal. And I will bless them that bless thee. That's good too. And curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. That's something. That's something. Wouldn't it be something if you could wake up and your day was composed in part of people thanking you for all the good things you've done in the world? Wouldn't that be good? It's not impossible for that to happen. So Abram departed. Yes, as the Lord had spoken unto him. And Lot went with him. And Abram was 70 and 5 years when he departed out of Haran. That's old. Now Abraham lives a long time, but this is also part of the story. So he has a wife who can't have children. He has nothing. Obviously, he's been hanging around Dad's shack for a little too long, given that he's 75, right? It's time to get a fire lit underneath him a bit. And so he's not got much going for him, but he still decides to move forward. And I've seen this too, you know, like if you don't have your destiny in hand by your time you're 30, it's rough. You start hurting. And if you don't have your destiny in hand by the time you're 40, then you really start hurting. And 40 is a real fork in the road. The fork in the road, that's always where you meet the devil, by the way. And that's because every time you have to make a decision, the possibility of evil beckons. That's why that is. I had a friend, I've told you a little about him, and he killed himself just after 40. You know, he had had a book published with a very small press. He was quite a good writer, but he could not get himself together, and it hit him too hard at 40. And I'm not saying that it's hopeless at 40. I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying that partly because of these verses, but also partly because of what I've seen in my clinical practice. I've had people come to me who have had very chaotic and ill-spent lives, let's say, who were in that neighborhood of age, and it's true for people who are older as well, who then decided to make a real effort and to try to make where they were better, you know, instead of being bitter about where they weren't, because that's the bitterness that really does you in. It's really not good. It's the opposite of gratitude. It's the manifestation of resentment. It makes you malevolent. It's very, very bad to be bitter. It's hell to be bitter. And if you're 40 and you're not successful, then you have to accept your lot, and you have to start to improve what's right in front of you. And if you do that, it doesn't take very long. It's quite interesting to watch people. Things can be a lot better in 6 months, and they can be way better in 2 years. Like, it's a struggle, uphill struggle, but it's by no means impossible. And I don't know, again, what the limit of that is. I suppose it depends to some degree on the degree of your commitment. But anyway, so it's another indication of the real validity of this story. God isn't setting this up to be easy, right? Abraham's old, and his wife is old too, and more than that, she's barren. How is he going to be the father of nations? How is he going to be successful? Well, the initial departure point is insufficient, radically insufficient. And that's very inspiring, because it means that you can start from where you are.
What were you like when I was 25? Well, I was obsessed. 25, so that would have been 87. I'd been in graduate school for 2 years. Well, you know, when I was 25 or so, I probably weighed about 138 pounds. I smoked like a pack of cigarettes a day. I drank tremendous amount of alcohol. I was from northern Alberta, this rough little town up in northern Alberta called Fairview, and there were long winters there, and my friends were heavy drinkers, and most of them dropped out of school by the time they were 15 or 16, went off to work on the oil rigs, and it was a rough town, and we drank a lot. I started when I was 14, and and so I had a lot of bad habits, let's say, and things that were, and I wasn't in great shape physically, and I was also still intellectually obsessed by, as I am now, and so that would have been in 85. But I decided around then, about 85, 84, something like that, maybe a little earlier, that I was really going to try to get my act together, and so I started doing that. First of all, I quit smoking. Well, that took a long time because I eventually had to quit drinking too in order to quit smoking, and I started working out, started playing sports, which I'd never done. I was a small kid. I'd been skipped a grade, and I was small for my age, so sports were never, especially team sports, were never really a domain of expertise for me. Although I skied and went trapping with my dad, went cross-country skiing and camping and all that. So, but when I went to graduate school, I started swimming. The first physical exercise routine I did, I enrolled in a swimsercise course, I think it was called. So it was me and this like really overweight kid, and like these 60-year-old women and men, they could out exercise me like mad. It was really embarrassing. Me and the overweight kid, we'd be just panting ourselves 3/4 to death at the end of the bloody workout, and these 60-year-old women who weren't in great shape were like chatting away as if nothing was going on at all in the pool. So that was quite embarrassing, and as was going to the weight room, because when I started I could barely bench press 75 pounds, and people used to keep coming over and helping me, which was the last thing I bloody well wanted, but certainly needed. And I got to the point where I could bench press 225 pounds. I think that was the best I did, and I gained about 30 pounds of muscle in a year and a half. So that was a good thing. So like I was kind of a wild man, and I'm a little bit manic in my temperament, and so I was kind of going every direction at the same time. So, and I don't regret that. I had a fine time when I was a kid, but I needed really to get disciplined, and I had to do it because I was working on these hard problems that that I've been discussing with all of you, and I've been working on them really obsessively since I was probably about 18, maybe even earlier than that. Got to the point around 25 when I was in graduate school trying to get my PhD, so doing all my research. Like I published 15 papers by the time I graduated with my PhD, which was I think by a fairly large measure the most papers that any graduate student at that time had ever published at McGill. I think that's right. It might have been twice as many, or maybe twice as many, maybe even 3 times as many. And at the same time I wrote Maps of Meaning, which was a terribly difficult thing to do, because I was writing about 3 hours a day doing that, and I couldn't do all that and continue with my misbehavior, my sort of what would you say, my hedonistic my massive hedonistic consumption of alcohol and all of that. I just couldn't keep it up, and also work seriously on the issues that were at hand. So I had to stop. That's a sacrifice. I had to stop messing about and straighten myself out. And I got married. Well, the woman who's my wife, Tammy, who I've known since she was 8 years old, she lived across the street from me in this little town called Fairview, and I was in love with her like the first time I saw her, which is quite the bloody thing. So that's worked out pretty well for me. But she came to live with me about the same time, and we decided jointly to get our act together, and we swore that we'd tell each other the truth, which I think she's actually done better than me. Like I don't think she's lied to me ever in our entire marriage, which is unbelievable, and it's been so useful because I can really tell her things and we can really talk. So I tell you, if you want to have a good relationship, man, you embed it in the truth, because if you don't embed it in the truth, you don't have a relationship. It's just lies. It's a tissue of lies, and it will dissolve in the chaos as soon as a crisis comes along. So the truth is a terrible thing, but not compared to falsehood. Another piece of advice: do not practice things that you don't want to become. Because one of the things that happens, let's say you you take Danish speakers and you play Danish backwards to them, and you do a scan of brain activities. Like their brain's lighting up like mad because they don't know how to listen to Danish backwards. So you get a whole bunch of brain involved in a new task. But then as you practice the task and routinize it, less and less brain is involved. So what happens is the activation, this is in your standard right-hand male, and the reason I'm using that as an example, because that's the kind of simplest default brain in a sense. Women are more diffusely organized, and so it's harder to exactly talk about their neurological structure in a simple way. But in a right-handed male, what happens is the activity starts to shift to the left, and then it shifts backwards, and as it does so, the amount of tissue that's activated gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until you've built a little machine that takes care of that sort of thing. But the thing about that machine is that it's a little machine, it's a habit, and it's actually there, it's built into you. So be careful what you practice, because if you practice it enough, then it becomes, it's like it's you, it's the default you. And then if you want to change it, you can't just undo that stupid machine, it's there permanently. What you have to do is you have to build another little machine that shuts it off. And then another machine that does the other thing. And then if you get stressed, the little machine that shuts the first machine off will stop working and back your stupid habit will come. So you know, people used to talk about the development of character. And there was something about that was absolutely right, because character is how you build yourself across time. And it really, really matters. Only practice what you want to become.
How can people cope with the pain of unreached potential?
Well, that's a really good question. Look, every ideal is a judge, right? So you posit an ideal and instantly you're in inferior position in relationship to that ideal, and that can be crushing. Okay, so what do you do about that? Well, one answer is no ideals. Well, that's not a good answer, because then you don't have anything to do, right? And that deprives you of a main source of pleasure, which is generated as a consequence of observed movement towards a valued goal. So if you have a high goal and you see any movement towards it, there's a really powerful potential kick there. So you don't want to dispense with that. But then if you set up an ideal, it can judge you very harshly. So then you have to rearrange your reward philosophy. And instead of punishing yourself as a consequence of perceived distance, you reward yourself for incremental movement forward. And that's not just theoretical. Look, I was stopped by 3 guys on the street this week, 3 separate occasions, and they all told me the same thing. They said that they had read or something I wrote, or listened to something, or watched something, and that it had been helpful. And whenever anybody says that to me, I always ask them, okay, exactly what was helpful and what changed, because I want to know what's helping so that I can understand the target and hit it better. And generally people are pleased to tell me, although sometimes it takes them a while to formulate exactly the description. But all 3 of them said, I stopped comparing myself to other people. So I stopped comparing what I didn't have to what other people had. I left that off the table. And then I started to reward myself for improving over what I was yesterday. And that's profound change, because it means that you actually get your reward structure transformed. And that's a big deal, because that's your source of positive emotion and enthusiasm, encouragement, all of that. So now you can start to encourage yourself for genuine improvement. And it's also pragmatically extremely intelligent, because incremental improvement repeated is virtually unstoppable. And that's like the hallmark of behavioral therapy, that idea. Because what a behavior therapist does is you come and you say to me, things aren't the way I want them to be. And then I say, well, how would you like them to be? And how are they not that? So we lay out the problem, the territory. And then the next thing we do is lay out a trajectory, which is, okay, well, here's something. You're lonesome. You don't have a partner. Okay, so what are incremental movements can you make towards that goal that you would do that would be helpful? And so maybe you negotiate with the person, because that's what you do if you're a reasonable therapist. And you say, well, look, why don't you decide as a consequence of the conversation, why don't you write out a description of yourself for a dating site? Don't post it or anything. Just write it out. And then let's see if you actually do that. And so then the person comes back next week and they say, I did that. And not only that, I posted it. And you say, great, what's the next step? Or they say, geez, I just kept avoiding that. And then you say, okay, well, we need to break that down. You avoided it. Well, could you write one sentence about who you are right now while you're sitting here? And sometimes they can do that right away, or sometimes they can't. And then you make a microanalysis of that. And what you do is you reduce the magnitude of the move forward until you hit the point where you actually will do it. And that's like the secret to good negotiation as well. If you're negotiating with your wife, maybe you want one of her behaviors to change. And then obviously she has to be on board with that. And hypothetically, that's going to be a reciprocal process. But what you want to do is find a small improvement that is measurable, that's implementable, that will be implemented, that you can then reward. And that's how you can have your ideal. You can have whatever ideal you want as long as you're willing to reduce your movement forward to achievable increments. But that's okay because they compound. So, and I really learned this as a therapist. It was one of the things that was so fun about being a therapist is you can take someone through this process and start them on just the tiniest goal. And it just seems trivial. But they'll do it, and then they start moving faster and faster after that point, once the direction has been established. And people make incredible improvement over, not unreasonable spans of time. A few months, maybe a few years, which is not nothing, but it's not decades. I saw that time and time again. So aim high, but reward yourself for small incremental improvements, especially ones that repeat every day.
I think that's one of the challenges we have in the modern era, because social media shows us the highlight reel of everybody else's life, but we get to watch our own failings from a front row seat, right? We watch ourselves blunder through life. We realize just how far away from our potential we are. But nobody else actually knows that. No one else knows the podcast you could have recorded, the business that you could have built, the book that you could have written. In a very, very real sense, you are only ever competing against yourself. But because
and that's it's absolutely right. That's why the individual, that's exactly why group categorization of people is so dreadfully wrong. It's like you really are your only comparison group, especially as you get older, because your life is so idiosyncratic and peculiar that look, you have to care what other people think. It's stupid to think otherwise because you have to be social and you have to be aware of what other people are doing and all of that. So this is psychopathic individuality, but it is genuinely true that no one has your set of opportunities and limitations. And so the comparison just isn't real. It can't be sufficiently multidimensional. Because maybe you see someone who's rich. I've met many people who are very, very rich. And you can look at their lives and they have these huge houses and material plenty, and they're shielded from many catastrophes that would hit someone without those resources harder. But their lives are still full of exactly the same troubles that characterize human life in general. And so you compare yourself on one dimension. You don't see, well, the person's worked 80 hours a week for 40 years and it's blown all his relationships out of the water.
Now, the baboon here, who's supposed to be basically just a fool when the story was first written, he turned into what's essentially a shaman across time. And So he represents the self from the Jungian perspective. Now the self is everything you could be across time. So you imagine that there's you and there's the potential inside you, whatever that is, you know. And potential is an interesting idea because it represents something that isn't yet real, yet we act like it's real. Because people will say to you, you should live up to your potential. And that potential is partly what you could be if you interacted with the world in a manner that would gain you the most information. Right? Because you build yourself out of the information in the Piagetian sense. But it's deeper than that too, because we know that if you take yourself and you put yourself in a new environment, new genes turn on in your nervous system. They encode for new proteins. And so you're full of biological potential that won't be realized unless you move yourself around in the world into different challenging circumstances, and that'll turn on different circuits. So it's not merely that you're incorporating information from the outside world in the constructivist sense. It's that by exposing yourself to different environments, you put different physiological demands on yourself all the way down to the genetic level, and that manifests new elements of you. And so one of the things that happens to people, and this is a very common cultural notion, is that you should go on a pilgrimage at some point to somewhere central, and that would be, say, like the Rock in the Pride Rock in The Lion King, because you take yourself out of your dopey little village, and that's just the little bounded you that everyone knows and that isn't very expanded, and then you go somewhere dark and dangerous to the central place, and while you do that, you have adventures and they toughen you and pull more out of you, like partly because you're becoming informed, which means information. It means you're becoming more organized at every level of analysis, but there's also more of you too. In cathedrals in Europe, especially at Chartres, there's a big maze on the floor, a circular maze, which is a symbolic representation of the pilgrimage for people who couldn't do it. And so it's a huge circle divided into quadrants, which is a Jungian mandala. And you enter the maze at one point, and then you have to walk through the entire maze, north, east, west, and south, before you get to the center. And the center is symbolized by a flower that's carved in stone. It looks like this. It's big, this maze, eh? It's large, so that you can walk it. And that's a symbolic pilgrimage. It takes you to the center. That's the center of the cross, because it's in a cathedral, and that's the point of acceptance of voluntary suffering. That's what that means. And so you walk through, Jung called that a circumambulation. You go to all the quarters of the world to find yourself. And so, well, the self is the baboon in this particular, I think he's a mandrill actually, in this particular representation. And he lives in the tree. He lives in the tree of life. It's a baobab tree in this particular. So he's the spirit that inhabits the tree of life. And he's the eternal wise man. That's a way of thinking. So is the king, but he's sort of a superordinate king, or an outside king in some sense. He's the repository of ancient wisdom, and the king is the manner in which that wisdom is currently being acted out in the world. And so they're friends, and that means that the king is a good king, because if the king was a bad king, he would be alienated from himself, and that would make him shallow and one-dimensional, and that would make him a bad ruler. No union with the traditions of the past. To be a good ruler, you have to rescue your father from the underworld and integrate that. And of course, that's a main theme in this entire movie.
For better or worse, life is short. How can we add a sense of urgency to it?
Well, I would say by reminding yourself that life is short, that'll add a sense of urgency. By noticing, I calculated, I don't know, when my parents were in their 70s, 60s perhaps, I usually saw them about once every 2 years. We communicate a lot more than that, but we live a long ways apart. So I calculated, well, my dad's probably going to live till his mid-80s or late, somewhere in there. And he's 70, let's say. I'm going to see him 40 more times. It's like, okay, 40 more times. That's urgent. So you better get it right, because you don't have it. You don't have that many opportunities. It's the same when you're formulating relationships in your adolescence, late adolescence, and early adulthood. You don't have that many experiments to run, and you get old a lot faster than you think. So attention is an underrated faculty. It's not the same as thinking. It's watching, to see what's there in front of your eyes, and to guide yourself as a consequence of what you perceive. It's the faculty that transforms thought if you let it. So, and your conscience alerts you as well. Tick, 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 you're wasting time. And very few people are happy with that. Some are burdened by it more than others, but virtually no one escapes that voice of conscience. I suppose to some degree that's the willingness not to engage in self-deception. Chapter 3 in Beyond Order is about that. People don't really repress the things they don't want to face, they just fail to unpack them. Like maybe you're on YouTube regularly, and every time you shut the computer off, you feel somewhat disgusted. But you don't pay any attention to that for a while, for 2 years. But then you decide you're going to pay attention. And then you find out, well, the reason you're disgusted is because you're wasting your life and you know it. And that disgust is indicating that. But unless you attend to the disgust and unpack it, let it reveal itself as informative, you don't know what the message is. You just have a sense of disquiet. It's not easy to transform that sense of disquiet into an actionable plan. And often you have to talk to someone about it as well. You have to discover. So it's not like you're repressing the emotion exactly. It's that you don't undergo the difficult process necessary to unpack it.
If the goal of life is to live a life which in retrospect we are glad that we lived, it's important to give ourselves perspective, to develop that metacognizance, to step away from the urgent, to step away from the phenomenological day-to-day existence, because the present self is a petulant child. It's lazy and it wants the path of least resistance and that glass of wine and that new movie on Netflix and the couch looks really comfortable. Very rarely does it do...
Yeah, well, that's the danger with impulsive happiness, is that it does have that present-bound quality.
And in retrospect, that can lead to a life that's not well lived.
Generally, yes. Life definitely places philosophical demands on you, whether you want it to or not. And so it is useful to step back. I mean, that's likely why the trait openness evolved. That's the creativity dimension. That's the dimension that allows people to engage in philosophical discourse and to think laterally. And it does allow you to step back and look at things on a broader scale and to generate creative alternatives. The problem with examining your assumptions is it's very disquieting, because you want things to act the way you predict and desire them to act. And you work within a set of axioms and you act them out in order to maintain that predictability, that desirable predictability. If you mess around, the more fundamental the axiom that you question, the more uncertainty you release. And some of that can be positive, but plenty of it can be anxiety provoking. I mean, just imagine that you're in a relationship and it's maybe a year into it, you haven't formalized and finalized it, but then one day you allow yourself to ask the question, is this the relationship I want to be in? Well, that's a fundamental question, but just imagine now you're destabilizing your entire future. You're destabilizing your present. You're destabilizing your past, because while engaging in the relationship, you're acting out the assumption that it's the proper relationship. But now you question that. That means the story you told yourself about what was happening while it happened, even though it's already happened, was wrong and something else had happened. And then you have to think through what actually happened. So it's unbelievably demanding. And the more axiomatic the assumption, the more certainty is cast into troublesome chaos. Now, you could say, yeah, but the alternative is worse. And I believe that often that's true, but the thing about the alternative is that you can always forestall it. And it's a very powerful temptation, and no wonder. Do you want to dig up the body now, or do you want to wait a month? It's like, well, it'll be more rotten in a month, but it's not a month. It's not now, right? It's not now. And so I understand why people don't want to delve into things, even if their emotions indicate that they should. I mean, I would see this all the time. If you're trying to settle an important issue with your partner, let's say, that can be a tremendously troublesome excavation process. And there's no shortage of pain. But if you sort it out, then maybe things can be better. Doesn't mean it's easy or pleasant. Quite the contrary. It's like surgery. It's not. It's like surgery to remove something, that shouldn't be there. It's necessary, but man, it's still surgery. Or learning that it is an existential threat, but that you can handle it.
Correct.
Which is really what people learn in exposure therapy that's effective, is the thing they're afraid of is frightening, but they're tougher than they think. And so, and that's very useful to learn. Yes, I do believe, well, it's also the case that if you decide that you're going to delve into trouble as it arises, you're likely not to avoid the delve-in process more than necessary, so the thing won't grow into a monster that's quite so large, and so once the relationship you have with your intimate partner is reasonably well constituted, and you decide that you're going to address problems as they arise, then it's less burdensome than the total reconfiguration that might be necessary before any of that has been started. It's like it's a form of mental hygiene, I would say, in some sense, and you do get better at that with practice.